All right. Good day, guys. It is good to be here for another episode of Chairmen of the Boards. We are in the Miata. It was feeling a little light without Brian, who couldn't make it today, unfortunately. But we picked up a hitchhiker along the way, and a great one at that. What are the odds of us driving down the road and we see none other than Marcus Catanzaro? Did I pronounce that right again this time, Marcus?
You've always nailed it.
Okay, I'm very self-conscious. If you can tell, I'm very self-conscious about pronouncing people's names incorrectly. Marcus has been on the show before. I've known Marcus for years and years, and he's becoming a great friend of Chairman of the Boards as well. And so it's so good to have you here. You are, Marcus, if I can say this, you are the first one to have essentially invited yourself onto the show, and I couldn't be happier about it. Do you want to actually introduce the topic today and why you felt it was a good thing to chat about?
Yeah, because you guys now have a job with your fan base to educate and to bring up these topics. And something happened at a gig recently, and it instantly made me think of you guys. And I was like, this needs to be talked about from the right perspective. And the topic is the exciting and thrilling topic of tuning. We were talking before we recorded, and there's so much information out there about tuning. Even more recently, there's been some really great kind of episodes of other competitor podcasts and YouTube series of compensated tuning, sweetened tuning, and stuff like that, which we will go into. But it's always so technical. And I don't think that's helpful for, the people at home that play guitar, even for professionals that I work with. They don't want to know the technicalities. They want to know why they do what they do and why it works and why you do what you do and whether that's possibly a better avenue to go down or not. So I think what's cool is to actually discuss it between us and kind of open it up and maybe at the end of this 50 minutes or whatever, people are like, oh shit, actually I think I should be tuning this way, or I'm going to attempt to tune this way.
Or at least dive into, maybe the way I've been doing it all these years might not be the best way, or at the very least, the thing I like about talking about this type of stuff, or things that are maybe a bit more subjective, like signal chain or whatever it is you're doing with your pedalboard, is at least you can become aware that there are other ways you can go down that avenue, do a bit of research, and even if you come back to the way that you're currently tuning, it's for good reason and good cause. And I think, I think that's great. The other thing I probably should have done on my intro, Marcus, is actually give people a reminder as to why you even have the credibility to talk about this stuff. And Marcus, I know you don't want to brag about yourself, but I'll do it for you. Marcus has been on the road with, any number of massive acts from Fleetwood Mac, Childish Gambino. You're currently in a studio right now, which I hope you tell us a little bit more about, where, Mick Jagger's been through there, a whole bunch of these massive artists that you work with, and they have these issues that we're going to talk about with tuning, and you kind of have worked with some of these guys and kind of helped them along with some of the fixes around their tuning as well. And so it's a real honor to have you back on the show, man. Even if you did invite yourself.
Thanks, man.
I was very happy to get the text.
I just thought, Mason said at the last one, come back anytime, and I came back.
He meant it.
I didn't realize that was like a figurative, thing of speech.
Nope.
But here we are.
No, we're glad you're here, and it takes the pressure off us, Marcus, because now we don't have to come up with an idea. You've already presented it for us.
That's right. I mean this wholeheartedly, Marcus. In future, please invite yourself on.
Yes,
I'm going to be on
anytime
every week. Yeah.
So
this week we're talking about whether your machine heads will be gold or silver. Buckle up for the next 1 hour, and yeah.
Can you tell us where this kind of first came up and give us a bit of the backstory and what you're now doing about it? So let's chat about first where this kind of first came up and when you realized that maybe tuning isn't as straightforward as we all may have once thought.
Yeah. So listen, like you said, my career up until very recently was as a guitar technician touring the world for lots of big bands, and I guess I've always known, even earlier in my career, I would always use the same tuner as the artist previously. I think that's always important to have, the specific brand and model that the artist is going to see on stage you should have. And I never really thought about that. I never really dived into it. It was just something that I always had as a kind of bottom line principle. And then when I started a tour, I would always talk to the artist and say, hey, can I watch you tune your guitar? Because there are really obvious things like strike rate, right? Like, are you using a pick or your thumb to tune? Are you on the neck pickup or are you on the bridge pickup? Some people tune obviously like openly, some tune with a harmonic, some people tune on a fretted note. So like all of those things are variables that as a guitar tech you understand and you take into account, but I never really started thinking about it. And then about 5 years ago, I started working for Steely Dan, and John Harrington, the guitar player, the longtime guitar player of Steely Dan, is, a musical genius, and everyone in that band basically is required to have perfect pitch. And it's a very well-known thing. Donald Fagen has perfect pitch. I have seen him stop shows because something is off, he can stop and he finds it physically uncomfortable. So he'll stop something and make sure that we sort it out. So I started working with John, and the reason we dived into it is because we were discussing how the guitar has to be perfect. We, with a regular band, you have a little bit of allowance, right? Especially with a distorted guitar or, maybe an affected guitar. With Steely Dan, it's quite clean tones, perfect pitch, all those things. So we went down the path of Evertune bridges, which I hadn't worked with a whole lot previous to him. And we started kind of diving into the way we want to use them, how we want to set them up, and would they even work? And that brought up the conversation of how he tunes his guitar and how when he plays, it's in perfect pitch for Donald Fagen. Even though you're fretting, different guitars have different nut heights, they have different, the actual frets themselves could be jumbo, they could be medium, all these like little factors that do slightly change your tuning. How do we work out with John, where we need to tune for him to be perfect every time? And here's where we get into the nuts and bolts. We actually went onto a scent tuner, one that shows the physical sense, so the minus, the plus, which is kind of randomly hard to find now. The Peterson app is one of the only tuners really that actually does this still. The Kemper still does it, which is great. And John tuned the guitar and would play a song and would watch how the chords basically sat within this very minute range of in tune, inverted commas. And we worked out the exact compensated tuning that John needs for his guitars based on the way he plays, based on attack, based on the way we set the guitars up. So we worked out, for example, that the low E sits around minus 12 cents. So 12% under
that's quite a bit
tuning. It's quite a lot, yeah. The A sits around minus 8. The D sits around minus 2. And then again, you go back to the G and you go back to around minus 10. So it's a large drop again. The B goes to minus 8 again. And then the E is almost dead on. So this is based on his playing. It's custom to him. If someone at home tuned that way, it's probably a good chance it wouldn't sit well. Maybe they don't fret as hard. Maybe they don't play as hard. So
Does
long
it
story
depend
long,
on where that
that's where
song
all
is,
this
though,
comes.
Marcus? Like where he is on the fretboard? Like if the majority of his work, let's say, is in the 5th position, would you temper the tuning based on that position on the fretboard? And would it be different per song? Like if it's cowboy chords, the intonation would be slightly different than if it was, let's say, at the 5th fret or the 8th fret or whatever it is. Is there any compensation for that?
Yeah, it does. Generally, the short answer is yes. But as you get higher up the neck, you're talking more about the intonation of something versus the actual tuning of the string at open position. So it gets kind of convoluted and confusing. And I'm not, even though technically this is my job and in my career, I'm not an expert either. And we said before we started recording, the cool thing is there's not really a right or wrong answer. So I think that if anyone ever tries to tune shame you and give you facts about tuning and why you're wrong, they're probably actually wrong because there is no wrong answer. But yeah, Mason, generally you're right. Especially if a certain song like Peg or something for Steely Dan is really quite high up the neck, we will obviously play those chords and fret those notes and check and compensate. But yeah, it opened up this world where I was like, why don't more people know their exact numbers? I call it compensated tuning. Peterson call it, sweetened tuning. A lot of people call it sweetened. And then more recently, Peterson have really lent into this. I realized recently buying the new Peterson tuner, it comes preloaded, like the preset is guitar mode, which is sweetened tuning. So it doesn't actually ever come in equal temperament. It comes instantly. Which would be like a straight now.
A440 and then equal intervals from there.
Yeah. So then once again, it sparked my attention. I was like, that's really interesting. Now Peterson have decided that, people should be tuning with some form of sweetened tuning. So I kept looking into it even more. And I started working somewhat recently for Waddy Wattell, the very famous session guitar player who plays for Stevie Nicks. And I was out this year on tour last year on tour and this coming year on tour with Waddy. And taking over from the tech who'd worked for Waddy for 20 years, he had kind of basically said in very broad terms of like, we detune Waddy's guitars so that when he plays, they're in tune. They've never looked at a cent tuner. They've never worked out the numbers. So I started working with them to work out what these numbers are. Because for a guitar tech, it's terrifying. It's so hard to replicate the exact tuning an artist wants if you don't have a detailed number. If you can't look at a tuner and see, all right, cool, when I strike it, it says -13, and then it falls away from there, it's really hard to replicate. And a lot of tech
does the Bigsby
and people and artists
cause problems in that regard? Because his main guitar has a Bigsby, doesn't it? It's like a 60 Les Paul.
Yep.
And then he has that white one.
It does, yeah. That's a tag, who John Taggart, his longtime tech, made. But yeah, all those things, play parts, and this this situation gets deeper and deeper. But a lot of artists will know, like if you're using a strobe tuner, for example, a lot of people will know that when they hit the string, they want it to hit, the strobe to stop moving and then to start falling away quick. And that generally will mean that it's slightly detuned from 440 pitch, right? But like that's just an eye thing. Like what the artist sees and what I see could be different, and it's a feel thing. So I started diving into this world of working out the exact numbers below zero. I think that more people should do it, and I think it's a good thing to talk about. I was curious kind of how you guys tune and what tuners are you using, and how do you know a guitar is in tune? Because actually in tune doesn't mean in tune.
I am actually going to be probably surprisingly ignorant here, but I do have a story I want to tell you guys about how my dad taught me to tune. He's a piano tuner. But before we get there, I want to throw it to Mason for a quick ad break from some of the sponsors that make this episode possible.
Yes, thank you, Grant. And thank you, Marcus, again for being here to talk about tuning. And the great thing is that many of the tuners with which we may be speaking of today are available from one of our sponsors, the Guitar Sanctuary. You can head over to theguitarsanctuary.com, which is Dallas-Fort Worth's area premier boutique guitar dealership for all things, whether you need tuners, whether you need overdrives, whether you need beautiful boutique guitars or custom shop guitars and amplifiers. They have it all available there. And you can check out all of their offerings on their website, again, theguitarsanctuary.com. Tell them the chairman sent you. Check out their offerings online or head there in person in McKinney, Texas. Check out the Guitar Sanctuary. Secondly, our friends over at Neural DSP are offering our listeners a special discount code for every plugin that they have available, with exception to brand new plugins, which will be available for this discount after 90 days. Using the discount code Chairmen, CHAIRMEN, you get 30% off any plugin that you could want. And if you saw our recent episode of The Guitarist Behind with Charlie Hunter, we exclusively used the Corey Wong plugin. We used it not only for the bass DI sound, but we also used it for the Clean Machine guitar plugin for the guitar side of Charlie's instrument. Absolutely sounded amazing. Highly recommend that you check it out. Also, they have the ability now where you can edit your quad cortex on your desktop or your laptop, which is incredibly handy for those of you who are like me that want to just get a little bit more fine-tuned and don't want to edit on the interface of the quad cortex itself. So please do check that out. And again, use that coupon code Chairman for 30% off over at neuraldsp.com. Lastly, our friends over at Sweetwater have a brand new app called the Gear Exchange. And this allows you to be able to buy and sell your used gear on Sweetwater, and it gives you this added benefit, which none of the other players in the game allow, which is to keep 100% of your earnings. How do you do that, you may ask? Well, if you take any of your earnings and you decide to put them on a Sweetwater gift card, this will allow you to be able to maintain 100% of everything that you earned, and you can spend it on stuff that you'd already be buying anyway. And in fact, I just sold some stuff recently and was able to buy a brand new Gretsch 6120 Brian Setzer. I'm waiting for it to arrive. It's going to be a cool guitar, and it basically allowed me to fund things that I would be buying anyway, and it's almost like a cool layaway program. You sell your stuff, you build up these gift cards, and then you're able to drop them on something that you actually really want or that you really need. I love it. Sweetwater.com/choose. You can set up an account for free, get buying and get selling, and I will pass it back to you, Grant.
Awesome. Thanks, Mason. I'm excited to see this Gretsch, by the way. I think it's going to be a beauty. So when I was just a little boy, I was probably 11 or 12 years old. My dad still is a piano tuner. So he tunes pianos all around our area.
Is he well-tempered, would you say?
Oh, yes. Very well-tempered. But
piano tuner show.
One of the things that my dad has always done from day one is he uses an A440 tuning fork. A lot of piano tuners will use an actual tuner like what we're chatting about today. And I asked him why. Like, why aren't you just using a tuner? It sounds so much easier. You can just do it per string. And he says basically the end result is the piano is not as in tune as if he was to use an A440 tuning fork and then use harmonics and relative pitch to tune the rest of the piano. So he gets a better result. And
which is basically stretch tuning, right? For a piano?
I don't know. I've never heard the term. I've never heard the term stretch tuning before. That's a good question. But basically what he's doing.
I think that over a piano, if you were to tune every octave, because there's multiple, obviously much more than a guitar, if you were to tune every octave and key by the end and the beginning, you would be out with each other. So stretch tuning is basically allowing compensating tuning, what we're talking about, allowing the end and the high to actually come closer, out of tune technically, but closer to the middle.
Yeah, okay.
Strange.
Interesting. No, that's cool. That's a good term. I'll store that away in my tuning library here. But what he's listening for is the harmonics or the dissonance between the notes. And if you have ever heard this on guitar, for those listening, you might do some harmonics and you can hear the waveform go faster or slower as these notes are kind of fighting against each other. And so my dad taught me to tune with harmonics on the 5th and 7th fret as you go up the strings. And he basically said, without realizing it, he was teaching me compensated tuning. He basically said between the low E and the A, you want the notes to, the wave, that fight to basically be one cycle per second. And then you go from the A up to the D. And so he would teach me how to tune like that. And I realized as I was tuning with tuners, I would usually quickly, as I'm playing, if I have in-ears or I'm at a gig or whatever, I would quickly tune with the tuner because I don't have the luxury of doing the harmonics. But then I would have to correct a little bit because my B string is like, oh, it sounds a bit flat. My E sounds a little sharp. And so you'd have to kind of correct after the fact a little bit. But that was my entrance into tuning. And I very quickly realized not everyone's dad was a piano tuner teaching him how to listen to harmonics. And, you learn how to tune with a tuner because that's a tuner's job. But I guess without realizing it, I learned early on that tuners can only get you so far, and it really does depend on the instrument itself. So I think that would be my experience. I don't know, Mason, if you have come at it a completely different way. I'm curious what your experience was learning how to tune a guitar and actually make it sound and feel good.
Yeah, I think excuse me, I think I primarily early days just had the Boss TU2 that everybody else had.
Classic.
And I don't think I paid much attention to like any sort of compensation. Like if the LED was green for that particular string, I felt like I was pretty good. As I became better at guitar and had more experience, I would notice that there would be maybe slight differences between some of those sounds relative to how I played, and now I pretty much use a Sonic Research ST. What is it?
The mini or the full size?
or ST2?
Yeah. So I use that
ST1?
one, which is a strobe tuner. I think it's called the Turbo Tuner. And
best tuner on the market.
That's my favorite. And so I pretty much dial it, to their guitar, which I don't know if that's, I don't know that it's compensated to the degree that the Peterson is. But I like it because I'll get it kind of dialed there, and then I'll kind of fine tune from there. So it gives me a good baseline to kind of start with. And then depending on whether my guitar has a floating bridge or some of these things will affect too. Like I'm also listening for bends and feeling like, okay, how much is it, like on a floating bridge, it's going to kind of come out of, like other things are going to come out of tune if I'm playing two strings at once, let's say. So I'm kind of listening to that compensation, knowing that the bridge is also pulling up and it's going to be going flat as I'm bending. And so I kind of, and I'm primarily bending either the B or the E string. So I kind of only really adjust for those strings. I don't bend a G very much. Or if I do, like I'll kind of just have to feel it out or kind of try to listen to it enough to keep it in pitch with everything else. But also if I have vintage style frets versus medium jumbo or jumbo frets, that can also affect the tuning because I'm pressing harder against the guitar and the fretboard depending on the type of frets that are there. And so some guitars, if I just tune it the same way as another one, I'll be pressing too hard and I'll naturally throw it out of pitch, or the string gauge too. If I have 9s on something and something else has 11s, how hard you press will affect the pitch, and I'll push it out of tune just by way of how hard I'm pressing down on the strings. So I'm making this compensation literally for everything. I use the baseline of getting it kind of where I am, and then I'm thinking about where I'm playing. If I'm playing something that's like a specific song, let's say for a YouTube video, I'll tune to where my position is going to be on the guitar, the string gauge that I have, whether it's a fixed bridge or a floating bridge. And I kind of take all those into account to a degree. I probably don't spend as much time as I could, but I spend enough to know that, like, when I go for that note, I know it's going to be there at however much I'm pressing down or however much I'm bending up to it, whatever it is.
I guess that's my point. It's like hearing you talk, that's a lot. Like, that's a ton of compensation. So, like, the overall point here, Mason, is if you blow up as an artist tomorrow and you have an amazing tech, you could have someone who's worked for 50 years for the absolute best. You're going to have the exact same problem as everybody else of like, how to tune your guitar. You know what you're compensating for. How do you explain to someone, this is how to tune my guitar? It's such an insane thing that in fact we're all up against regularly. And you don't realize how much you know your own instrument, your own playing style, and you tune accordingly. It's insane how much there is.
Yeah.
And from hearing, even just, I guess, explaining my perspective and hearing Mason talk about his and hearing all this talk about it, it really is something that I don't think you spend that much time. I can only speak for myself. I don't spend that much time thinking about it. I just do it because I want to feel, I hate that feeling of going up, like everything's in tune on open strings, and then I go up to the 5th fret on my B string. And why is it flat? I just tuned this thing. And so you compensate before that so you can avoid the feeling of that frustration of being out of tune after just tuning. But I don't sit down and think before I start playing, okay, I'm going to have to raise my my B string up by 1/8 of a turn on the tuning peg. I just kind of do it and then move on, So I can totally see what you're saying, that having to put this into words, it would be difficult. I'm struggling to do it right now, but it would be really absolutely hard. Difficult. I think one of the questions I have, Mark, is kind of floating around in my head as we're chatting about this, is thinking back. I used to have a Carl Carlton. That's a name I've always struggled to say. Carl Carlton by Duesenberg. I loved that guitar, but when I got that guitar set up, I remember getting it plecked once. Got the frets, polished. I got it plecked. It was set up, and it was just it was like a new instrument after it had been set up really well. And I'm curious what you do as a tech to actually make sure that you're starting from a good place. As in, what I mean by that, the guitar has actually been set up really well. The intonation, which you touched on before, maybe you can go into that a bit. The intonation has already been done well, so that an E on an open string is still an E on the 12th fret. Like how important and what do you do to make sure that you actually have a good setup rather than, so you're no longer dealing with maybe tuning issues, so that you can focus on tuning issues rather than just focusing on, man, this guitar actually just needs some work before we get into how this thing needs to be tuned. Like, what do you do to start from a good place?
Yeah, so I think you need some really solid basics. I think I will always say that machine heads are so important. Not every machine head is equal. For those people who this is kind of new and used to, there is always a gear ratio on a machine head similar to a bike or a car. And basically that's just indicating the amount of teeth that are on the physical cog. So lower gear ratio means you could turn more with very little difference. A higher gear ratio means you can make smaller increments in tuning. And that's a big deal because as strings stretch and the guitar wears down, maybe hasn't been serviced, you start needing to make micro adjustments. And like we're talking about now with compensation as well, you do kind of need those minute little moves. So if you have machine heads with a lower gear ratio, you're actually going to have a really hard time. You know, I think everyone's probably experienced, it always happens on a G. Once the G string stretches, you'll be tuning, and it'll go boom and jump a whole, tone or whatever it will be. That's generally because of your gear ratio or the machine heads. So that's number one. It's always a big thing. Pretty much the biggest thing is your nut. And I think it took me a long time as a guitar tech to realize how much, if your nut height is wrong, you're already up against it with tuning. So what does that mean? It means that if your strings are cut really high into your nut, you have a significantly longer way to travel when you push down the string. So if you tune on a high nut, you're perfectly in tune. Let's say you go to play an F. When your index finger hits that F, it's traveling the furthest distance from open to the fretboard that it will on the entire guitar, assuming that, the neck angle is right. So that could be a lot. That could be half of a semitone, in distance. So that F will be completely out of tune. And that's when you start having to compensate, like tuning down significantly so that when you play an F chord, let's say the song starts with an F, you're going to have to compensate down just to make that. So what you would do in that scenario is get your nut height right. So you're hoping to decrease the amount of distance between the string and the fretboard to the lowest possible, and that's a personal preference thing too. Like Wattell, for example, likes high action. He plays a lot of slide guitar. So again, we have something else, like another challenge in front of us where ideally the nut height would be lower and that would make tuning 10 times easier. But because he plays slide, we have to have a slightly higher nut. So now we have these tuning compensations. So on top of that, then you have things like the saddles. It raises a ton of questions of like, do you guys tune on a neck pickup or a bridge pickup? Overtones are a thing that is kind of real, especially if you have a low nut. And that basically means that like, if you think about if you grab like a wire and you made it taut between two people, let's say they're 10 feet apart, and you flick it in the middle so that it, like a slinky kind of thing, it rotates. It's doing more revolutions and spinning faster toward the ends than the middle because of the slack. And so what that means is the two ends have overtones. They actually are producing a high frequency because they're spinning faster than the middle. So that's why people will tell you not to tune on the bridge pickup because you're tuning closer to the string that's moving faster, and the neck pickup is more toward the middle of the string.
Yeah.
So that's
a
crazy fact.
Never considered that.
Something
but
that makes a
great
huge
point.
difference.
I've never thought about that. I tune on whatever pickup I'm currently on. That's what I tune on. So sometimes it's the neck, sometimes it's the bridge.
And that's not wrong.
And,
yeah, totally. And that's not wrong.
Yeah.
And then that begs the question of like, I can't tell you how many times I've been in this scenario where I've tuned a guitar the mathematical way or the guitar tech way or whatever, handed it to an artist, and the artist has gone onto their Boss TU2 and been like, this is not in tune. I'm like, well, actually, it's really in tune, so much so that the Boss actually thinks it's out of tune, And that comes back to like why it's important to always be able to see the tuner that you plan on using on stage, because They aren't all equal. And, you know, there's a ton of great videos online of like people with the lineups of the different brands of tuners, and they are really different. The sonic research is crazy. You can basically never stop the sonic research strobe from moving. It's that accurate that like you know that if it's moving slowly, it's probably pretty ridiculously in tune.
Yeah, we had a big problem with our NAMM booth. Our NAMM booth, I had outfitted, our 6 demo pedal boards with it, and people don't understand how to use it.
It's true.
There were people that were just like totally confused, and we had to go out that first night and get headstock tuners because so many guitar players had no idea how to use that thing. They were
once you get used to it though, it's like I can't move away from them now. I love strobe tuners, but so many of the guys that we set up boards for, they just no, can't do it. I hate how the strobe, like they haven't clicked with it, I guess. But so why do you say? Really, sorry, you go, Marcus.
Well, I think we're about to say the same thing. Why do I say strobe tuners are amazing?
Yeah, please.
I think because, so like if you're not going to work out your numbers of like, I want to compensate, Grant, you said your B string, you always compensate, for example, naturally, unless you're going to sit down and actually work out those numbers. For most people, that's not necessary. And most tuners, like I said, don't even show you those numbers anymore. So the great thing about a strobe tuner, if you are a person at home who plays with quite a hard attack, right? So let's say you play punk, metal, maybe you play jazz and you just happen to use like a 1 mil pick and you have quite a steady attack on your right hand. You want to be tuning as close to the way you play. So you want to always be tuning on a hard attack with a pick. You shouldn't be tuning softly with your thumb because it's not representative of how you're playing, right? So you should be tuning with a hard attack. And the great thing about a strobe is what I would do if I was working for that player is I would strike the note and I would want the strobe to basically stop and almost instantly start moving to the left out of tune. So again, you strike the note initially, it would basically hit flat and instantly move down. So what that means, if you looked at that in numbers on a Kemper tuner or the Peterson app, it would be reading, somewhere in the ballpark of -7 to -10. So your initial hit is in tune and then it will fall away. In general, that's the best way to tune a guitar is you want nothing to be sharp, everything to either be on or slightly flat. The human ear actually hears sharp before it hears flat. That's a fact, which is crazy. So you always want to err on the side of flat rather than sharp. So the strobe apps give you that ability to kind of work out, without working out your numbers, to work out where you want things to hit. So if I hit the note, if I'm working for a soft guitar player, for example, and I hit the note quite hard with a pick when I'm tuning and it's sharp, so the strobe is moving to the right, but then settles, it's kind of a little bit of a pointless exercise because the player's not going to be playing that hard. They're going to be playing soft. So I haven't actually gotten like a reading from the tuner that's indicative of the way they're going to play. And chances are when I give them that guitar, it's actually going to be slightly sharp, not in tune.
Interesting.
Grant, your face, am I baffling?
No, I'm just like, I'm just trying to.
You have this like look on your face, like either it's too much information or it's not well explained information.
No, I love this. I actually have a question for you about this, but before I ask it, I want to talk about a few more sponsors that make our podcast possible. Grant, take it away.
Yes, I think the look on my face is I just have so many questions to ask. So we'll get through as many as we can before the end of the podcast. But I want to tell you guys about Mono Creators. They are an incredible company. We have talked about them many times before in the podcast. And I can even see Marcus nodding along. Mono is a great company. They do obviously soft gig bags for guitars, pedal boards. They do a line of pedal boards as well, which they've recently updated. And the really cool thing about the recent update to the pedal boards is they now have a power supply that they have put a lot of effort into designing and coming up with a unique player-friendly shape. It's kind of more of almost like the shape of a power strip or power bar, kind of longer and in a rectangle shape. So you can fit it and slot it in many places where a power supply normally wouldn't fit on your pedal board. So you want to check that out. Isolated outputs, of course, high current, switchable. There's a whole bunch of features you want to check out with these new mono power supplies. And you can do that at monocreators.com. Use the code Chairmen, CHAIRMEN, to get 10% off of your mono order. I also want to tell you about Bestronix, or BTPA.com. This is basically the place you want to go for any accessories for your pedalboard. Actually, yesterday, I posted something on Instagram about USB cables and trying to get rid of the extra slack, and BTPA quickly commented back saying, hey, we got some rewirable USB plugs you can try out. And so I'm going to do that. I'm going to call up Brad and order some USB ends at btpa.com, and I'll probably even use my coupon code DACHAIRS, DACHAIRS, for 10% off your order at btpa.com. Anything you need, from cables, plugs, accessories, all the good stuff from Bestronix. Lastly, I want to tell you guys about Stringjoy. They really do bring the joy back into strings. Stringjoy is the place you want to go for any subscriptions that you want for your string services, or you can just buy a pack off their website and get it shipped to your door. Whether you want to get them shipped regularly or one at a time, Stringjoy is the place to check out for strings for your acoustic, your electric, your bass, in different material types as well. You can use the code BOARDS, BOARDS, for 10% off your order at stringjoy.com. And I think you guys are really going to love it. They also, I should mention, do coded and uncoded versions as well, depending on your preference. So check out stringjoy.com. Use the code BOARDS, BOARDS. So we are going to get back into the episode here with tuners. Should we just cut this section, Mason, and we can just wait for Marcus to come back?
I think Marcus is already here.
Oh, here we go.
Perfect. So let me ask this question to Marcus, because I've heard this talked about by several industry professionals, from people who work on the technician side to people that work as studio guitarists, where they always say you want to tune up to the pitch that you want and not down. So in other words, if your guitar is sharp, let's say on a G string, you don't want to just come down from let's say somewhere between somewhere sharp of G down to G. You actually want to go below the pitch and then come back up to it. Is this just technician sorcery, or is there a methodology to this?
That's true. So like with all gears, you want to be on the high, they call it the high side of the gear, not the low side. So it's tension based. So yeah, exactly. If you come down from a note, you're on the low side of the gear. So if a gear was to slip, you would drop even lower. So if you come up with a gear, you're putting tension on. So you always want to have the most tension possible as you tune up. So yeah, that's a really common thing I see. Even guitar techs do it, of like, they'll be tuning, they're slightly sharp and they just come down. You've got to come below the note and start again.
Is that where you just kind of come up behind them and you just slap them across the face? What are you doing? Rookie.
Yeah, I actually have I'd written this list of things that I see all the time. And I'm not shaming, again, I'm not tune shaming anyone, because like these are things I've done in my career as well, all through my life. And these little pointers that you learn as a guitar tech working with, I just did a show with the Eagles and Steely Dan last weekend, and the Eagles have about 17 guitar techs. And so I was talking to some of those guys, and we were discussing tuning, funnily enough, which I think is actually, I texted you from on stage, Grant, about this originally at weekend one. And yeah, discussing this, like these are all the tricks you learn. The other thing I see all the time is people tuning their guitar when the guitar is laying flat on a bench.
Interesting.
And that is completely different to when you hold the guitar upright in playing position because of gravity. The string is dropping, so and you're closer to the pickup, so you have more chance of overtones and all sorts of weird things.
I actually heard that is where John Mayer actually wrote the song from. It was Gravity, and it was talking about tuning guitar on the bench versus holding it and the pain that comes from that. And here
Guys,
we have
it's
this
so
epic
good today. So
this
I'm
epic
way too
song that has
serious, and
come
I'm
out of
missing
it.
so many great dad jokes.
No, well, you got tune shaming. I think that's the hashtag of 2024.
But yeah, Mason's right. Mason just mentioned their magnetic pull of the pickup, and that's also why a lot of people will tune on the neck rather than the bridge, because generally the bridge is a hotter pickup. It's got slightly more magnetic pull, and it's generally closer to the string.
Do you have a preference on pickup height, Marcus, in general? Because my attitude is to keep them as low as possible. Like obviously,
I tend to agree. Yeah.
And I feel like you can always turn up the amp more, and you can of course still balance the EQ of the pickup if you celebrate that. But I usually try to. On some Strat pickups, I will get elongated tubing and screws so that I can really get it barely above the pick guard, depending on the pickup. Yeah, so pretty low. I mean, not. Some of them won't go that low. So, without kind of rattling around, like I did this recently with some lace sensor pickups that are on my early '90s Eric Clapton Strat, and I had to get like longer tubing and longer screws so that I could get it to not just be kind of moving around in the pick guard,
wobbling.
I sometimes just mount the pickups on the back of the Strat.
Yeah, or just put the pickups on your amp,
on your belt. Just put them on your belt, and then you're good to go.
I do it by ear personally. Like I like to play a note and adjust the pickup. I feel like you can hear. I mean, I actually set up transparent overdrive sounds the same way. I like to go from clean to overdriven, and I think there's a sweet spot in between that, and it's the same with pickups. Like there's a point of no return, and I think just pre that point is the sweetest tone of
I watched this one guitar tech where he had like a really thin piece of metal which almost looked like a ruler, but very small. And he would in thin, and he would put it underneath the guitar string to see how much the magnet would pull on the on what would presumably be as close as you could get to the string without actually being the string. And he would use that as a gauge to determine how much the pickups were potentially influencing the vibration of the string.
Is that the theory behind it?
Say that again, Grant.
Yeah.
Is that the theory behind it, where you're basically, because this is actually new to me, I've always just adjusted pickup height without thinking about it, and again, just going by what my ear's telling me, but is the theory that you're trying to get the pickup, in your case, Mason, trying to get the pickup further away so that the interaction, as in the interaction of the magnet pulling on the string, is less? Yeah. In my mind, it was just output volume. Yeah. I always just lowered it. It's like, a bit lower output volume, I can get a different characteristic out of my amp.
It's that too. I mean, you're not wrong, but like, it's a good experiment when you do adjust your pickups. When you're too close, you'll find the resonance of the guitar goes away, and that's because the string moving freely is being pulled down by a magnet, so actually will stop resonance, and that kind of creates that kind of more boxy tone. It's like how it kind of sounds to your ear, but it's actually just that you're losing resonance of the actual guitar, and it's not actually going through the body of the guitar anymore.
Yeah, some pickups will do it to a greater or lesser degree. Like if you use a super distortion, from DiMarzio, there's certain pickups where it doesn't really matter how much you bring them down; they're still going to have some influence in that way. And so, and some people like the kind of the cost benefit of having a little bit extra output or whatever it is that they want, and they're okay with sacrificing a little bit of vibration. But for what I do, I don't have one of those pieces of metal that this guy had, but I actually thought that was a smart idea, because at least you weren't just lowering them without reason. You were kind of lowering them to the degree that it was kind of like it was nullifying whatever the impact was of the magnetic field, and then you were sort of balancing it out for the purposes of the EQ of the pickup.
Yeah, and that's kind of like, companies like Stu Mac who make, such, finite specific tools for guitar. that's kind of what they're trying to do. And it comes back to what we were talking about, or what we are talking about with tuning, is that so much of what we do and what guitar techs have always done is feel. So like to work out the nut height, I imagine if you lined up 10 guitar techs who are professional touring guitar techs, they will tell you they fret the third and then they touch the string above the first fret to see how much give there is. That's not a measurement, so to replicate, when you take over an artist like, Lindsey Buckingham, for example, or someone from Steely Dan or Fleetwood Mac, someone who's had the same tech for 20 years and knows feel, even myself with Neil Finn or someone, handing over, that is really difficult because we're not talking measurements, we're talking feel. And so companies like Stu Mac have tried to create tools, like now they have a gauge where you can measure the amount of nut relief. You can push down the string with a little gauge and actually write down a number, because so much of it is just impossible to communicate. And I guess that's the overriding point here with tuning, is like, how do you tune? It doesn't matter whether it's the right or wrong way. It matters that it's right to you, and how would you explain it to someone else,
So if I could ask this as we're getting close to the end of the podcast, then I have a feeling a lot of people might be listening now and maybe still feeling pretty confused as in the next step. So let's say for my whole guitar life, I've been using a TU2, I've been trusting the green dot, and now you're telling me that there might be a different way. What's step 1, 2, and 3 for diving into maybe a more accurate, I don't know if that's the right word, but tuning in a compensated way? What's my next couple of steps here?
I think Peterson have done a really great job with the new tuner with having so many sweetened tunings. I would suggest to everybody to go through, to get a Peterson tuner, or the app I think is, Mason, you might know, I think it's only $9 or something. And it's great. You can download as many sweetened tunings as you want. I honestly, I have a billion tuners, and I still, I did a gig last weekend. I still have an iPad with the Peterson app up for certain reasons, for certain guitars. Get the app and go through sweetened tunings. For example, and guess I don't know that I'm 100% right, but I believe the acoustic sweetened tuning is James Taylor's compensated tuning numbers. So James Taylor has notoriously always detuned his acoustic guitars because he feels they resonate in tune, and it's probably quite specifically the first 5 frets. Like, he plays a lot of really beautiful bar chords and kind of open chords.
Lots of capo.
So I believe the Peterson, and I think he has another sweetened tuning for capos, which is also the Peterson tuning. I think it says CAP on the tuner, right, when you cycle through the sweetened ones. So I would suggest, Grant, get a tuner or an app that can do that and go through, because everybody's ear is different. Everybody kind of hears things slightly different. Everyone's playing's different. And I think that you'll probably find a sweetened tuning or a compensated tuning that actually fits you better than the green light on a Boss.
And when you say fits you better, just to drill down a little bit more, fits you better as in, what do you mean by that? You'll fit in first position, fifth position.
You nailed it earlier when you said that feeling of when you go up to the 5th fret, you play the B string and you go, oh, and your shoulders raised to your ears and you're like, man, I just tuned this. A sweetened tuning might avoid that. You don't need to be a guitar tech. You don't need to know everything. I think if you can start with the best version of your guitar possible, so get it set up, by a professional and do that. But I think that you'll find that there's a tuning out there that might, based on your playing and how your guitar is, it might actually alleviate that shoulder raise at the 5th fret. You might find that compensated tuning just works for you up the neck.
And would you do this, let's say you're going on the road tomorrow and you're teching for a guitar player that has 10 guitars they're going to use. Would you have a different compensated tuning for every guitar, or would you generally use one and it works for that artist, that player?
I have a general compensated rule. So let's go Neil Finn, for example. I will always use the same compensated tuning, which I will tune with a hard strike, with a 1 mil pick, because he uses a really thick, almost bass pick. And then I'll always compensate the G string, because I know from watching him play and listening to him, he always slightly, his 4th and 5th finger, they always slightly bend the string. So I compensate them a little lower so that when his fingers naturally sit, it's in. And then, certain guitars, like I know that, like, his Les Paul, for example, the G string is a little funny and I will compensate it slightly lower. Definitely you develop these kind of rules, but in general, I think you're going to go down a wormhole if you do it per guitar. I think you should just find what works for your playing. And we're talking about minute changes that sometimes people won't even hear. A lot of people listening to this will be like, this entire thing is such a wank. It's ridiculous. And that's fair. It's a fair
but
call.
We
if
all
you play in a
know
punk rock
the
band,
feeling.
you don't need to worry.
We all know the feeling of being in tune when it's open, playing on the 5th fret, and it's not in tune anymore. So I think to a degree, some people might take this with some more or less credibility. Who knows? But I think if the goal is to mitigate that feeling across the fretboard, I think it's very valid, and I'm personally learning a lot here, and I really enjoy hearing what some of these touring these guys that have been playing for 30 years, what they're doing about it from their decades of experience, which I don't have.
And the fact that like it doesn't get better, meaning I have the exact same problems as you do, Grant, as anybody at home listening. Like I can pick up a guitar and tune it perfectly. And I have, a song to tune. So depending on my position on stage, I have sub frequencies that are a nightmare, especially with acoustic guitars. They create what we were talking about, overtones. I have maybe 2 minutes and 30 seconds, assuming nothing else goes wrong on stage, to get that guitar in tune. So I put my in-ears I have a Kemper in my touring rack, so I plug into a Kemper, and I have to play the chords from that song. I have to know what key that song's going to be in to make sure that even though I've tuned the guitar perfect, is it actually going to be in tune for that song? And, on this Stevie Nicks tour at the moment, I've been up against it. Learning Waddy Watel's tuning has been really difficult and eye-opening, and it's really, really challenging every single day. So it's kind of nice for people at home to know that it's like, it doesn't actually ever get better. It's just things that you constantly deal with as a guitar player and you learn to compensate for or whatever. And people probably do actually know what compensated tuning is or sweetened tuning, because really when you intonate a guitar, that's what you're doing. You're compensating. Like the reason why you fret the 12th is because you're saying, okay, cool, I'm in tune, harmonically, or I'm in tune with an open E string right now. When you fret the E string on the 12th fret, you're pushing down to the fretboard, right? So again, like we were talking about before, you're creating a distance down to the fretboard, which is obviously different to an open resonant string. So you're saying, I'm going to put this in tune, and that in theory is my compensation for like the distance to the fretboard and the open string. You're meeting somewhere in the middle. So everybody's actually already doing this, is just kind of thinking of it a little bit, more in detail now.
This has been an eye-opening episode, Marcus. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Marcus.
And insight here. Mason, do you have any last thoughts or questions?
No, I think that this is really good information, and I'm very appreciative of Marcus for this information, because I think it is something that's widely overlooked or at least not considered. And I think especially for people that are looking to make that jump, into sessions, or looking to make that jump into touring, these are all considerations that are sort of just like small differentiators that sort of stack the deck in your favor. And I think it's the stuff that the professionals that we all know and love have in their periphery, whether that's the people that are supporting them by way of their technicians and things like that. They're all doing this to a greater or lesser degree. So I'm just really appreciative, Marcus. Thank you, and I hope that we can have you on again soon.
Last time you said that, I came back, man.
Yeah, please.
And next week with Marcus Catanzaro.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Thanks for nerding out with me.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Really appreciate it. Have a good day, guys. See you next week.
See ya.